So we are diving into a series about the history of hot rodding. Kind of, if you think of a hot rod, a lot of people will think of your 32 Roadster, which is kind of a quintessential hot rod, but hot rodding can mean almost anything because it's basically just going fast or looking cool or hopefully a combination of both.
Well, I think you're right. To me, hot rodding is basically anything that a guy would tinker with. So you take whatever, maybe what somebody brought as stock and you modify it. To me, that's hot rod.
Yeah.
Right.
And and obviously that's expanded on what that could be. But if you go back into history, to what kind of was the quintessential origins of hot rodding, after World War II, a lot of people talk about that. Yeah, it was getting that 1920s or 1930s Ford that was junk,
right? And
people didn't want, but it was putting a bigger engine in it, stripping it down, making it a race car on a budget, basically.
Right. Well, because that's the whole thing. Freedom to drive your own vehicle, but also too, I think what hot rodders really look for is speed.
Yeah, it's
They're
about going
go
fast. Yeah.
Right. So,
and that's, you look at like the styling that a lot of hot rod has kind of brought to the automotive industry of, all of it is basically to go faster.
Right.
Like, so as much as like we talk about, chop tops and sectioning the body or channeling over the frame or lowering suspension, all that was just for better aerodynamics.
Exactly. Right. Because they wanted to go faster.
Exactly. So, I think if we go back to the very beginning of hot rodding, it's going back to who wanted to go faster.
Well, you mentioned World War II.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of stuff like that we have seen is mostly or post-war information.
And
that
that's,
most of are
well, and that's a lot of that would be, I'd say the hot rod industry really had its roots after World War II with veterans coming back. This is a very common, part of history of talking about that, because then they could get the cheap cars. They knew how to fix them up.
Yeah. They
wanted to have a little bit of adventure. You got a guy that was in a, P-51 bomber, and now he's got to come home and, drive a Lincoln.
30 horsepower Lincoln. Yeah, come on.
So they wanted that adrenaline rush. They wanted that speed. But that's honestly has always existed throughout history.
It has.
People have always wanted to race, always want to go fast. You look back at chariots in the Roman times to horse races, even bicycle races and wagon races, so.
Well, like you said, pretty much since the beginning of time, if there's been a contest with speed, it involves something that a man either rides, drives, or pushes.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, we talk about the horse racing thing, and I believe the term souped up or hopped up actually came from horse racing.
Yes, that's correct.
Because they would drug essentially the horses to try to make them run faster or longer or not tire out. So it's all the same stuff that everyone tries to do to go faster and beat the next guy.
It's true. Well, I'll tell you what, like I just said, there's not a lot of information that's readily available. Of course, the internet that has information about pre-war speed. So, but there's a few things that I personally have because there's someone in my family that actually is pretty well known prior to World War II.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier. Like if we wanted to really look at who were the pre-war pioneers of not just racing, but hot rodding, because essentially back then, especially, it was kind of one and the same.
Right.
Because you look eventually, NHRA was founded, even your NASCAR stuff that came from hot rodders. Those were like the sanctioning bodies for hot rod racing.
Correct.
You go back to the very early 1900s, and it's kind of funny. There was AAA, which we look at now as like roadside service, maps, and
discount tickets to the movies
and car registration. But they were one of the early sanctioning bodies of racing.
This is correct.
So that all kind of the early history of automotive had early history of hot rodders and racers.
Well, and also too, let's think about that. I think, you mentioned at one time that if you thought about racing at that time, there was pretty much only one form of racing, which was...
Well, there was only one form of transportation unless you were hopping on a train.
Right.
This is pre-plane, pre-automobile.
Right.
So it was horse racing, and that became a very gentleman type sport.
Correct.
Kind of not who you would associate with a hot rodder.
Right.
Because, it's your fancy...
It's more like your supercar owner of these days,
well,
right?
It's, if you had to look at it, it would be like, your F1 kind of, type lifestyle versus, you know, your weekend dirt track guy.
Well, let's think about it too. Some of the races were even like, let's look at the Vanderbilt Cup.
Yeah.
The Vanderbilt or family put on this race.
They sponsored it. Right. Yeah. So,
but what's funny about that is, of all places, you would think that would be back east, because that was more of the new money, or the old money was all back east. But honestly, automotive racing kind of spread out all throughout the country in the early days.
Well,
a lot of
it,
one particular
a lot of
area.
it in the Midwest. I mean, obviously your Michigan areas, which, you know, spawned tons of dealerships, but the Midwest, like from Indiana to, you know, Chicago, all that
Ohio,
had a lot of
those,
early automotive companies and a lot of races. And then California had a huge part to play because we had open land out here.
Well, we not only had open land, but honestly too, in the early 1900s, Southern California's real big wealth was oil.
Yeah.
And also oranges. So a lot, like even Beverly Hills didn't come out until like the 20s. Like they started selling Beverly Hill plots in in I think 22. So let's go back to like 1900, like turn of the century then.
Well, it was all ranches.
It was all ranches.
Los Angeles was ranches.
Area.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is the weather was so good. So people would come out here in the winter to winterize themselves, I guess you would call it. But that's when, you know, again too, racing was, well, hey, let's go watch the car races. Yeah. A lot of well-to-do people, like I mentioned, the Vanderbilt Cup was in Santa Monica, California, on Wilshire Boulevard.
Which is like
have a track.
the most traffic heavy street almost in LA. And
they carved out a racetrack of streets in Santa Monica, pretty much just kind of boarded them off with barriers and just went racing. Yeah. And it was extremely dangerous because you had people just along the side of the street watching, just like a rally car race.
And that's the thing too, is especially you look at that time, the car had only been around for maybe 15 years.
Correct.
If that, in certain areas.
Right.
So that was probably the first time maybe some of these people had seen a car. So it was a spectacle.
Exactly.
You know, I believe, I don't know if it was that race or some of the other ones, but I remember seeing, like, you know, if the population of Los Angeles was 1 million people at the time, 800,000 people were at the race, you know, something like that.
With every black Henry Ford car too. Remember that there's a photo that's like,
that's right.
It's just a bunch of just black cars and there's a racetrack out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, they would just set up kind of makeshift areas and say, hey, we're going to go racing. Yeah. And the other thing too is racing back then, the cars were fairly large.
Well, they were, I mean, that was the technology of the time. They weren't going that fast, but it was still pretty sketchy because they were almost more or less, I mean, they were horseless carriages essentially at that time. So, you know, you got someone going 30 miles an hour and that was a race.
Right.
When the horse could only go 20 miles an hour, let's say.
Exactly.
You know, so I think we're leading up to basically what we consider one of the first hot rodders, especially for his work ethic, his demeanor, his kind of anti-establishment, if you will, which is very hot rod-esque.
Yes.
But the first man to actually go 60 miles an hour is Barney Oldfield.
That's correct.
And you got a little bit of a connection to him.
Yeah. Barney was married to my great aunt. And again, he was married 4 times to 3 women.
So you can do the math on that.
Math. But yeah, Barney was married to my Aunt Hulda, who was my great grandmother's sister. Mm-hmm. My grandmother's obviously aunt. And growing up, I would hear stories about Barney all the time. And I actually brought her scrapbook.
Yeah. I mean, that's what was cool. We were looking through that a second ago and like, this is like legitimately a scrapbook of actual photos and newspaper articles and letters from the 30s.
From 30s. I mean, this letter I have right here is addressed to my granddaughter. I mean, my grandmother from 1936. And this is from Barney, who was out doing his what he called his barnstorming days.
Well, and that's so there's some interesting background story with Barney of he wasn't necessarily the most winning racer.
That's correct.
But he was the most well known and one of the most promoting racers at the time.
He got his start actually in bicycle racing, because let's go back to that, right? I mean, he grew up in the Midwest.
Yeah, so he was born in Ohio, just outside of Toledo.
Exactly. And, you know, he was not your upstanding citizen. He was the kid that would, like, you know, turn on the fire alarm, that kind of thing.
So a hot rodder.
So a hot rodder, right?
I mean, that's essentially the hot rod mentality is kind of live a little dangerously and, you know, break the rules and have fun.
And he was most known at the time before this as a bicycle racer.
Yeah.
Where, and I'm sure most of you guys have heard of like board track racers where they would actually take like 2x4s and lay them on the top and make like a velodrome.
Yeah, it's kind of an angled, so you could have some banks so you can carve
gain
through
momentum and stuff like that. And that's what kind of honed his skills though, is riding that bicycle, is learning how to throw the bicycle kind of around those corners, right?
Well, and there's one thing that I looked up on doing some research that maybe he didn't tell any of your grandparents or anything like that, is that supposedly his first bicycle he actually stole out of the hotel that he was working at.
Yes,
so he was working at a downtown hotel in Toledo, Ohio, and
just
snatched a bicycle and started going with it. And
but at the time that was a big deal to be a daredevil. Like, you didn't have TV, radio, you had a newspaper, and you had what was going on in your area.
Well, and you had people doing, there was like the Wild West, Wild Bill Hickok on the horse races, horse diving, like all those, the circus side shows. That was the entertainment of the day, because this was even pre-radio.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's very difficult for people to get information. So to see something like a exciting bicycle race, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
To see, just like how horse racing was a big deal.
Well, no, those were essentially the main races of the time period, were bicycle racing or horse racing.
So Barney was just looking for that daredevil. I guess you can kind of...
He's an adrenaline junkie.
Think of him like an action sports athlete at the time.
Yeah.
Right? And so he heard about a guy that was racing some cars around the area. Come to find out, it's Henry Ford.
Yeah.
And him and a buddy of
pre-Model T, anything
actually,
like that.
this was Henry's third time to try to do the car thing. And what he was learning is he needed that publicity out of somewhere to he needed a win, right? So he built this vehicle that came to be known as Car 999.
Yeah.
And he brought it to this event, and he was looking for daredevils to try to come out. He didn't hire anybody. He just said, "Hey, come out, you daredevils, and see if you can drive this thing."
Yeah, kind of almost like a challenge.
Exactly.
Putting it out there. Mm-hmm.
And him and a buddy of his, I think his name is like
Tom Cooper. Yeah, so Tom Cooper was one of the teammates that he had on the bicycle racing team.
Right.
And it was kind of, Tom was like, "Hey, dude, I need some help with this car, or like figuring this out, or like..." And he brought on Barney basically.
So they went up there and they went to this race, and come to find out the car didn't even start for the race. That's like the most iconic thing is that the car didn't start and it didn't work out. And so, but Barney and Tom got to know Henry pretty well and were like, "Hey, we want to work with you." So the next race they went to, Barney and Tom actually bought the car from Henry.
Yeah. Bought it for $800.
Bought it for $800
in 1902,
which is huge money. Yeah, it's huge money.
Yeah.
And they entered the race, and it was up to Barney to drive. But the funny thing about it is Barney had never driven a car before.
Well, and that's the thing too. We're 1885 was the Benz,
right,
when that came out.
Right. So this is 1902.
This is 17 years later, and this is essentially like if all of a sudden we had if
we had a flying car.
If we had a flying saucer,
right,
that came out, and it would be like, "Hey, go drive it."
Can you drive that? Right.
No one really had driven a car before, essentially.
No.
Yeah.
But the benefit to Barney was he learned how to use the controls that morning. Which, when I say controls,
it didn't have a steering wheel.
It had a tiller wheel.
Yeah, but that
was at the time.
He grew up on a farm.
Yeah.
They were
a lot of carriages had that.
His father was in a farming community. He was familiar with that aspect of it, essentially.
Exactly. But he went out and he actually won that race. But he won the race because he had bicycle knowledge that would allow him to go into the corner really deep and slide the car around. Yeah. And that's what was the deciding factor of how he got out in front.
Well, and he was sliding around the corners, essentially drifting. So first drifter,
wow.
Barney Oldfield.
Right.
He was drifting around the corners rather than braking and going around. All the other racers would put the brakes on, turn, and then keep going.
Right.
He just slid it around, and that allowed him to get ahead of everybody.
Yeah.
And that's what they're saying, that car that Henry Ford built had no springs,
right?
No shock absorbers.
Nope.
Obviously. It was overpowered for its size, which, that's
hot rod.
Yeah, that's a hot rod.
Come on.
All right. And it had that really odd and very mechanical steering that needed someone to basically wrestle it around the track.
Right. So, but that race actually helped Ford, again, the race on Sunday, sell on Monday, that really catapulted him into the public's eye.
Yeah.
Because all the newspapers recorded about that, race, and obviously Ford winning in a Ford car gave them the boost.
Well, and one of the things, especially I think maybe that helps with that, is back then horse racing, it still is today.
Yeah.
But horse racing always, if the horse won, the accolades would go to the jockey and the owner of the horse.
Correct.
Whether it's some guy named Robert,
Right.
that owned the horse, he was getting just as much praise. So a Henry Ford car
Right.
winning, being driven by Barney Oldfield. Basically, so both people are getting the accolades on it.
Exactly. Right. Right. So it really did. It gave Ford the push that he needed, and obviously, 1902 that was something that he needed.
Yeah.
So-
And that's what, I mean, we looked at, if we talk about the Ford Automotive Company and Ford Motoring Company, it's the huge breaking moment is the Model T. Well, that was over 10 years. That was 10 years later.
Right.
So, but you had to get something kick-started to
momentum.
build
Yeah.
up to that.
Yeah.
And we mentioned earlier that, Barney was the first to go a mile a minute, or essentially a 1 mile circular track.
Correct.
Lap time of under 60 seconds.
Correct.
Is actually how he built that record. And that was actually done in 1902 as well.
Yeah, that's right. It was Grosse Pointe, Michigan.
Yeah, so there's the Grosse Pointe track in Michigan, and that was the first. He had set track records previously,
Right.
and they were usually always a mile circle track, and he had done a mile, or no, excuse me, a minute and a second. So
right, yeah.
he did a mile
Right.
in just over
A minute.
a minute.
Yeah.
But
Think about it. We take that for granted. We're like the open highway right now. You're going 60 miles an hour. You're going slow.
well, you're going. I mean, what is it? Like some of the electric supercars can go 0 to 60,
Yeah.
in like 2 seconds.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So he was doing that in 60 seconds.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
So imagine that's just the difference though of the time period, but it exponentially ramped up from there.
Right.
I mean,
your fastest horse is 45 miles an hour.
Well, and
Right,
yeah, and you look at, later on some of the records that he set, or even just information about racing, and it's like, oh yeah, now the guys, 10 years later, they're going 130 miles an hour.
Right.
They're going 100,
Yeah.
they're setting land speed records, a couple years later at 200 miles an hour.
Right.
It ramps up significantly, but it also took somebody that could, wrestle around a car like that to make that and push the limit to go that 60 miles an hour. So if you're still rocking your stock stereo system, you need some help. And you need to go to Powerbase and check out their OEM direct fit line of speakers. Basically a plug and play operation on any newer Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Nissan, you name it. And I actually got a full set in my Toyota 4Runner. It sounds amazing, especially considering you're basically just replacing the factory speakers. So go check them out at powerbaseusa.com. Use the code AUTOREV24 and you can get 10% off anything on the site, including these cool little Bluetooth speakers. This one right here is the Sound Cube. Clip it on your backpack, take it down to the beach. And what's really cool is this split speaker. So you can put one in the kitchen, one in the backyard at a party. Everyone's having a good time listening to the same music. Basically got like full stereo, almost surround sound system in this little package. So if you use the code AUTOREV24, you can get 10% off. So go check them out and take a listen.
And think about that too. Like, would you be comfortable? Because no one's ever gone that fast before.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, this is like man on the moon kind of stuff.
Yeah. What's going to happen?
Yeah. Like, I mean, this thing going to blow up in front of me? I don't know. Right.
Are my ears
Right.
going to?
So when I mention this to a lot of people, people always ask me, what was his Indianapolis career like? Because he did actually race the Indianapolis 500 many times for different companies too. At first, after the Ford press, he actually bought a car from Mercedes-Benz, which is kind of more of his like most famous cars.
Mm-hmm.
They call it the Blitzen Benz.
Yeah.
And that was actually the car that he raced the 1910 Indianapolis 500 and won that race. So he won it once.
Yeah.
And that was also the next car that he had to buy, because you would think that a guy that famous at the time that people would be throwing cars at him. Wasn't that the case?
We also got to remember too that this is very early stages, and this, if you were racing a car, you were a millionaire essentially.
Right.
And he was at least like kind of the anti-hero and elite of that, but it was still a very expensive sport.
Well, because like you said, there was a lot of gentleman racers, guys with a lot of money, and Barney was that scruffy kid from Ohio that had he didn't have the oiler that rode with him or the mechanic back in his place that had the white coats on.
I was going to say a lot of them, like even some of his people like De Palma and stuff, who were kind of with him had done some bicycle racing in the past that graduated as well into auto racing.
Right.
Everyone on his crew had to be in bleached whites, which is like you're not wearing white to work on a car,
especially those guys.
back
No,
then.
they were because they were terrible. There's oil all over the place. There was soot all over the place.
But that's and Barney didn't have any dress code for his guys. Nope. It was very rough and tumble, blue collar working, but that also attracted your general American audience,
right? Exactly.
Because it wasn't completely unobtainable. At least what it looked like.
Well, that's one thing we should bring up too, is there were a lot of injuries and a lot of deaths back then.
Yeah.
And also too, I bring up the word oiler. I should kind of clarify that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, like car 999 was a single seater car, but most race cars at the time, you rode with an oiler who a mechanic, as you were racing, would take an oil can and oil certain things as it was driving without safety equipment. Zero, not even a seatbelt.
Yeah. And then granted, like we're saying, they're barely going 60 miles an hour, but also you got another car right next to you.
Right next to you. Yeah.
You're going around a small circle track. You've got the crowd going.
Exactly.
And it was
dangerous. It was very dangerous. And like I said, a lot of people lost their lives. So Barney actually, he advocated for safety. And after his racing days were over, most of his, I guess, time
his
was
notoriety
spent,
and
using his notoriety,
his career.
He was able to, go after safety. One of the most important things that he did was he was the first guy to do an enclosed race car.
Yeah, and with a roll cage.
With a roll cage. Yeah. And that was actually because, again, so many people were being killed.
Yeah.
So he built what was called the Golden Submarine.
Well, and that's, so one of the friends of his, Bob Berman. I want to say Burnham.
Yeah.
But no, he in Corona, California, there was, that whole city basically was a racetrack back then. And he died during an accident in that. And that kind of forced, him and Harry Miller.
That's correct.
To build an enclosed car with a roll cage in it. Cause before that, it was all open wheel, open roadster, everything.
That's right.
But you roll that, your head is,
you're done.
What's contacting first.
Exactly.
Basically.
Right. And Harry Miller was the horsepower god of that time.
Yeah.
He was the guy that really
huge in Indy and stuff too.
Yeah. Right. So, and they were both pushing for that safety, deal. And what's really funny too is Barney got banned from AAA's sanctioning body too, by the way.
Yeah. And it was around that same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Period. Like, cause he was doing exhibitions and it basically was, like we said, it was a millionaire sport.
Yes.
At that time, he was not a millionaire.
Right.
He was a farm kid.
Yeah.
From Ohio.
Right.
And he wasn't really playing their game.
Right.
He was the hot rodder.
Well, and that's what
but he had to make money somehow.
He had to make money somehow. Yeah. And the thing about it was he was good at it. Mm-hmm. So your $5 a day, time was that time where you would work, maybe you'd make $4 or $5 an actual day, where Barney would make like $150 to $200 a day barnstorming.
Yeah.
Where he would link up
but
with
that was all unofficial.
It's all unofficial.
And not sanctioned by AAA or
Indy.
The
gentleman guys didn't like that.
Yeah.
Because to them, they didn't want the whole public to see. They wanted to see them at
unique times.
An
elite.
Right.
Yeah, they were calling it an elite.
Think like Kentucky Derby type thing, right? But he was going out to the masses saying look at what I'm doing.
Yeah. All the county fairs and the state fairs, it was like showing off some new technology and some new Daredevil thing. I mean,
and when you say Daredevil, because he linked up with a few biplane Daredevils as well that they would barnstorm. And he would be the guy on the ground that would race the planes. He would be the guy that would, obviously after racing the planes, but he'd also show people like, hey, look at these. Here's pneumatic tires by Firestone, because he was a big Firestone guy until he started his own tire company.
Yeah. Well, and that's what he was sponsoring. Yeah. When he actually did get banned, he was hired on to be the Firestone team racing manager, or racing team manager. And then I read too that AAA or Indy would not let him, even though he wasn't racing, they wouldn't even let him on the property at first. And finally they had to negotiate all that. But it's like, this guy's an ambassador for this sport, but he's not doing it by your rule book. So we're going to outlaw him.
He's the original Dale Earnhardt. He's the original, screw you guys, I'm doing it my way.
Yeah.
Right. But having the results to show it off, but also the innovation, like we mentioned, the Golden Submarine, pneumatic tire safety. He was a big advocate for seatbelts. When seatbelts, nobody wanted to be stuck in a car because they thought that you were going to burn in a car.
Well, and seatbelts weren't even a mandated thing until 40 years later.
Right.
So
the other thing too is Barney had the persona though. He had catchphrases. If you ever heard everybody say well, me, that was actually a famous catchphrase that Barney would say after his racing. The other thing too,
Yeah, like how'd you do that? Or that was so crazy.
You know me,
yeah,
right? The other thing too is his signature cigar. People thought that he just liked cigars. My grandmother told me it was because he was missing teeth, and when he would drive the car, it would rattle his teeth so much it would hurt. So he'd use the cigar to buffer his gums.
Yeah,
between
something
racing.
to bite on, like
Right.
to not
it's just
chatter his teeth to death.
It's just crazy to see a guy race in Indianapolis with a big old stogie out of his mouth, just racing.
But
down
that
a
makes
track.
the style. That makes
Yeah.
his persona out of it. And we talked about Indy a little bit, where he did win one of the Indies. Well, then he was banned
exactly
for life,
right
from
life
Indy.
and that, yeah.
Like usually, you got to think to be banned for life, you got to do something pretty horrible.
Right.
But he didn't really. He just did not like their program.
He didn't play well with others.
Yeah.
And that's why people just, like you mentioned, some of the guys with more money would try to keep him out. The irony there, though, is the Indianapolis Museum has a whole entire wing dedicated.
I'm hoping they have like a big thing that says banned for life or something.
They do
like,
mention it. Yeah,
I was going to say, they got to
it.
at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's pretty funny, though.
They came around finally.
Yeah.
They realized.
Okay.
Yeah.
But already touched all racing too, because even like at the Daytona track today, they still even have a banner that has Barney's name held up in there. And the thing about that too is Barney would go down. You mentioned it. Other guys would go to different areas throughout the country seeking land records, and Daytona was another spot that he took a car to and ran that as obviously going after.
Yeah, a lot of the land speed stuff on
right.
on the beach in Daytona, because that was huge open land, and you can flat, and you do it when the tide's out, and you got compacted sand, and that's a lot of people were racing for that, and a lot of the big land speed stuff I know we're going to get into in some future episodes, but a lot of those early records were before Bonneville,
right?
Were set before even the dry lake beds were set out there in Daytona, and then in the same thing in England on some of the beaches in England.
That's correct.
Yep. One of the things too I was looking at is he had a lot of, like we said, he had a lot of firsts.
Right.
So first to go 60 miles an hour.
Correct.
First to go 6 miles an hour at Indy.
Correct.
First also partner on a auto dealership in the United States.
I didn't know that.
Fisher Automotive.
Okay.
He was a partner.
The body company.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he was a partner in that.
Oh.
And helped bring essentially what the first dealership was to the U.S., and it was in Indiana.
Wow.
So
I did not know that.
A few more firsts for your great, great
I know it's
uncle.
I have to figure that out.
Once removed,
right?
Twice removed, whatever it is.
Exactly. So, the Green Dragon was another one of the cars that he built, and it was pretty famous. I'm not really too versed in it, but I know it was a very significant car.
Well, and you mentioned too that he was given some cars, so like the Stutz.
Yes.
Like that.
Yes.
That was an early car company that was involved in a lot of racing.
And they were a Midwest company too, so that made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
He's a hometown boy, so that made a lot of sense. And they actually started giving him cars. That was when he was a professional racer. I believe he won the 1914 Corona race in a Stutz, if I'm not mistaken. As I know, my grandmother had a couple photos of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So one of my favorite photos of Barney, and how I've been told it was taken, is back in the earlier days of photography, when people would pose for photographs. Usually the most important people would be in the middle, and they would space people out kind of in a class almost.
Well, and having some of that photography knowledge, and in the very early years, it was obviously a lot of it was, maybe not by this time, but you got to stand there for a minute for the exposure.
Well, right.
But also too, depending on, it wasn't exactly an exact science like a digital camera, and you can see exactly what the photo is going to look like.
Right.
Sometimes it might vignette.
Yes.
On the outer edges of the frame of the photo, or distortion on the lens.
Right.
So my guess is,
if
whoever's going to be the most
end.
important person is going to be right in the middle.
Right. And there's a photo that I had from my grandmother's scrapbook that is him at the 1939 World's Fair in Chicago. And they're at the Chrysler exhibit, which looks like they built a building for it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing Art Deco looking deal. And sure enough, you've got...
Well, the World's Fairs back then
They were huge.
Huge.
Yeah. I mean, that was the event to go to. Mm-hmm. And you look at the photo, and it's Barney standing next to Firestone and Ford, and then it just kind of spaces out. But if you look at the very end, the guy in the very end is Harley Earl. Which I'm just like, to me, I'm like, well, but it should be the other way. Like,
you said 1939, so that was that was kind of the big. Like a little bit after the beginning of his
He's probably
career.
The new guy in the design department.
He's the new guy, but he's going to be the guy kind of setting the stage.
Chrysler too. He's not. I mean, I don't know if that might have just been a networking
Well, if you said
event,
if
but
Henry Ford was in that photo too, so it's probably just all the automotive people getting together.
Right.
Yeah.
But that one to me was very significant for me because I was always such a huge fan of Harley Earl, and then to find out, like looking at it, going like, and I asked my grandmother, "Is that Harley Earl?" Or she's like, "I don't know who you're talking about."
Well, yeah, and if you want a little bit more information on Harley Earl, we haven't done any full episodes on him, but the recent concept car episode had a lot of the very first concept car essentially was the Buick Wide Job that Harley Earl designed a couple years prior to that photo being taken. So, that was kind of his beginning, I guess, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
So like I mentioned, he was married to my grandmother's aunt, Hulda Bapst is who she was. I don't know much about her just because I think Barney was such a bigger figure that my grandmother wouldn't bother talking about her aunt. She would talk about her uncle.
Yeah, she talked about him, not her.
But it's funny because in this letter it says like, hey, you can tell your Aunt Hulda like I'm being a good boy, like doing my job. That kind of stuff I think was kind of funny. So the guy was a drinker. The guy was like a partier.
Of course,
based on kind of who he was. So he's writing letters like, "Hey, tell your aunt that I'm doing my job," type thing. It's kind of hilarious.
Yeah, like, "Hey, cover for me."
Yeah, cover for me.
Cover for me, kid.
And even like signs it, "Your dad." Like, like, "Hey, thanks, kid." So it's kind of funny, but I know that they didn't have any children. He had a daughter with another one of his wives. So obviously blood wise, I'm not directly related to the guy. But it was still just fun. Like growing up, like I learned how to play the piano on his piano. Right.
Cool. Yeah.
Like there's a few things that got kind of like passed down.
Well,
to the
that's
family.
to say, you were probably just at enough of the time where there was some stuff before it all just cycled out completely.
Well, because my grandmother's father owned a lot of oil wells around Santa Monica that time. So he was those guys that Barney was trying to stay away from. Daddy Paul was that guy's name. And Daddy Paul had money. So, they lived in the same area. They lived in the Brentwood area, which was kind of new and up and coming.
Yeah, that was near Beverly Hills.
Near Beverly Hills. And Barney died in 46, but before that, he was a movie star.
Well, I was going to say, like, I remember you saying, like, for a while, he was kind of, or at least during the racing time and the exhibition time, he was the most well-known person
pretty much in the world.
Right. Because he was on, I mean, if all you had for news was newspapers back then and maybe a little bit of radio stuff starting to pop up.
Yeah.
If you were on the cover of, or on the front page of a newspaper.
Right.
You were one of, a handful of people at that time that had that, that they could say. That wasn't like, oh, this person passed away or this war was declared by this guy,
right.
Something of an achievement.
Well, and think about it. The newspapers, even today, they still need filler. So things like this was good filler for them. It was just like, hey, this guy won a mile a minute. This guy raced a horse. This guy, had raced an airplane, that kind of stuff.
Well, and that's, you mentioned that. And I'm wondering, do you know when that year, when he first did that? Because like, the airplane wasn't invented until like 1911, right?
Well, no, that's what he would do most of that stuff in his later part of
years
to keep the business going.
But still, you look at like if you were some local person in the Midwest or even LA or whatever, and you said, hey, this guy in a car, which has only been around for 20 years, is going to race a plane that's only been around for 10 years.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
That's a big deal.
Yeah. So, but again, too, going back to safety, he made a deal with the Firestone Company to start his own branded tire company. So he had Oldfield tires, and he would go around throughout the country and teach people about, different tire safety, how to maintain things. Then also too, he was, like we mentioned about the roll bar and stuff like that. But his thing too, he was after safety belts. That was a huge thing for him. And even too, I have this thing in my grandmother's scrapbook where it's like a big like bumper sticker that says, safety, use it or something like that. Yeah, like here's this thing that says,
"Oh wow,
welcome Barney, I drive safely," and these were the banners that people would hold up, when they would drive by.
And the support,
the support banners. So, stuff like that was kind of what he did, and then he would do a lot of auto testing too, where people would ask him like, would you please drive my car? So of course they would do the same thing they did with Henry Ford, which was, hey, Barney drove it, so it must be good.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a stamp of approval, from him, and also he would put it through the paces because, like we said, he wasn't the gentleman racer. He was the hot rod guy that would, put it to the limit.
And I mentioned too that in the Hollywood days, in the early days, again, like you got to remember 20s, 30s, it's really kind of getting its steam going. And they didn't have a stunt coordinator for cars. So guess what Barney did? That's why a lot of the early car movies that you'll see is, Barney will either be in the credits or he might even be the driver.
Yeah.
But he did have a speaking role where he did say, you know me.
Well, and there's another quote or whatever. It wasn't one that he said, but it's something that I saw when I was researching that came into the common vernacular was, who do you think you are, Barney Oldfield?
Right. Usually like when a cop would pull you over or someone would say you're going fast, like, who do you think you are, Barney Oldfield? The guy that zooms by you on the freeway, well, there goes Barney Oldfield.
Yeah.
And that was a very common catchphrase. Yeah.
And what's really cool and what's interesting is, we look, and we'll get into this later, at the later years with NHRA being originally the safety safari race, it's like, yeah, these race car drivers were daredevils and pushing the limits, but they were also, they wanted to keep racing.
They want to keep racing, right, yeah. I mean, let's think about it.
No, and it
wasn't about helping your fellow man. It was about you just wanted to keep racing.
Yeah, you didn't want to be hurt or worse.
Yes.
You wanted to be able to keep going. So, but a lot of those guys is then who, you look at now where all these safety features that we have, a lot of them started in racing, and guys like Barney were the pioneers in that.
That's totally truth. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting being that it's kind of like, okay, well, he was one of the pioneers. Do we know if any of the later racers or hot rod guys like really looked to what he had done, or was it too far removed?
I think it's too far removed.
Yeah.
Because again, too, Barney died in 46. When guys were getting home from the war, and that's when hot rodding again had its second shot.
Yeah.
So I don't think maybe, some of them might, but
yeah, were they,
I don't really know if they were too influenced because it almost started over. I mean, look at it. You
kind of had to reset a little
using
bit.
A belly tanker. You got people that are using unusual things. But I think Barney probably inspired guys like that because you look at things like the Golden Submarine. The Golden Submarine looks like a belly tanker. Mm-hmm. It looks kind of strange.
Well, and that's, you had to go for at that point, with hot rodding, with the early racing and stuff like that. Yeah, it was, you're basically, these early cars were the same design as a carriage. Right. They, like I said, they weren't going that fast.
Right.
And then, the technology with carburetors and the engines started getting way, better and better.
Right.
But then you would start to limit yourself as far as aerodynamics would go. And so something like the Golden Submarine was more aerodynamic than earlier cars. But then, you get into your belly tankers and your streamliners.
Yeah.
And those are just as aerodynamic as you could get for the time period in order to, go as fast as you could, take advantage of it.
Not only that, just me personally, looking at a car from his era to say a car to maybe Vic Edelbrock on the lake bed, senior Vic Edelbrock, where Barney's cars were very mechanical. Mm-hmm. At the time period, like I mentioned, an oiler, someone's just to get around a track.
Even compared to now,
right?
Obviously 100%, but even compared from the early 1900s to the 1940s,
yes,
very mechanical.
So I think what really, the Vic Edelbrock seniors and Alex Exidius guys, they looked at less is more. They looked at let's strip a lot of this stuff off. Maybe this will make me go faster.
Yeah,
So I think it's just kind of a transfer.
And too, like you said, needing to if you got a 10-minute long race and you have to re-oil the engine constantly,
come on, right,
you can only go so fast.
Yeah.
But then by that time where you're not worried about any of that stuff.
Right, because that technology kind of, and also too, the war effort really made it because now it's also, hey, we were doing this in the war. Mm-hmm. So, and you got, and think of this too, the war also gave a lot of people a lot of technology. Oh, yeah. Where a farm boy all of a sudden now is a mechanic, whereas before he was a farm boy.
Yeah.
And I think that might have been probably part of the thing with Barney too, is there wasn't a lot of mechanics, there wasn't a lot of engineers. We mentioned the Harry Millers, who were the super geniuses,
but comparatively for that time, they only had so much to work with, and let's be honest, for that time period, they were the engineers.
Exactly.
It's not maybe the traditional engineer we look at or looked at even from the 50s or from the World War II, but when you're looking at a generation before people riding horses, and you're not, or on a locomotive, steam train,
right,
or a steam engine, and now you're,
driving,
capturing explosions in a confined space in order to go down a road. That takes a lot of thought and engineering and knowledge to make that and improve upon that.
True. I mean, that's call the witches. I mean, that's the kind of weird stuff you see something that's
that's
spitting down the road. That's bad
that's
news.
what they were saying is like at the time period, because, and this is why we consider Barney Oldfield kind of a hot rodder or one of the pioneers of hot rodding,
right?
Is because at the time cars were only for the elite. Like it's basically like having a private jet now.
Exactly.
And they were loud. They were smelly, and they would scare the horses.
Yep.
Or they would maybe run someone over crossing the street.
Yeah.
There's no stop signs or anything back then. And you had to be a rich, snobby guy basically to own one.
Right.
So there was a disconnect, but Barney helped kind of bring that spectacle and that racing and that to kind of your common working man.
Right.
And that's really kind of then where hot rods got started, was with your regular everyday guy.
That's true. Well, hats off to him, because I think without what he didn't do, I don't know if we would have done what we've done. So
no, exactly. And is there any other little stories that you had that you remember from your grandmother?
I mean,
telling you about Barney,
because
this is some of the stuff we're not going to find on Wikipedia or anything like that.
Well, here's the thing. He liked whiskey. And we know that personally, we have a friend of ours that has a bar that's an homage to Barney.
It's called Oldfields out in Venice and in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And yes, did you have more stories about the whiskey?
Yeah. Well, because
before we dive into that,
I guess around the Olympics, the 32 Olympics.
Okay.
LA was kind of the bustling, the new America.
Yeah.
And I guess he got a little drunk at the opening ceremonies, and there was a lot of chaos, and they ended up getting arrested. So,
all right.
That was the one that my grandmother told me he spent a night in jail during the opening ceremony. So
of the Olympics in LA,
and my grandma was pretty polite. So
yeah.
I'm sure she didn't. She held back.
Well, and that's to say, I mean, we can imagine of that time period and what a car racer was, and what to have that, cigar and that gruff mentality against all the rich guys. We kind of know what he's about, Same thing as like we talk about Babe Ruth from that time period, and
absolutely
go out drinking and eating steaks the whole night before, and boozing it up and knock it out of the park.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Oldfields bar.
Correct.
So that's one of our friends, Bobby Green, who owns a Old Crow Speed Shop, and they also he made his living basically on restoring and resurrecting bars and restaurants and landmarks around Los Angeles. Yeah. And one of his early ones was Oldfields.
That's correct.
And so kind of paying an homage to the early racers, because Bobby is very much of that style. I mean, he was even in the Oilers car club.
That's correct.
You mentioned having an Oiler. There was a car club called the Oilers, and Bobby was a member of that.
Right.
I think he's got a huge knowledge of all of the early eras of racing, kind of the pre-war stuff.
Correct.
Before getting to your Alex Xidius, your Vic Edelbrocks, your NHRA drag racing, your Robert Petersons, of the hot rod fame. I think we should probably take a visit with him and kind of pick his brain a little bit, because I think that's really going to set the stage then for when we dive into what's considered like the origins of hot rodding, if you will. And he's got some really cool, cars, belly tankers. He's raced some of those. A vintage belly tanker from the 40s. He's raced it out at the Dry Lake Beds or even out at Bonneville.
Helped create an event, the Race of Gentlemen, which again, it's focused back on the racing of that era.
Yeah.
So racing on the beach in New Jersey, racing on the beach.
Pre-32 cars, So I think we definitely need to take a visit with him and kind of help get the stage set for the original hot rod era.